Hi. I'm Anna Heller. I'm the director of the Cornell Fine Arts Museum, and tonight I have asked one of our extended team members to introduce the speaker. I want to introduce Abby Ross Goodman, who is, as I said, part of the larger Rollins teams, and Abby is really the brains behind the Alphond collection of contemporary art. So for those of you who haven't met her, she's the person who started conceiving, even before the Cornell Fine Arts Museum was involved, conceiving that awesome collection at the Alphond Inn. And its themes of its curricular themes that so well mesh with the education that we offer here at Rollins. So Abby, in her capacity as curator of that collection, chose the artist who is with us tonight to be a part of that collection. And so I thought, since she was in town, it would be a much better introduction if it came from her. So Abby, it's yours.
Thank you, Anna, for that very generous introduction. It is really a collaborative process that we engage with all of our colleagues here at the museum and at the hotel, and most importantly, the Alphonds. But it's a privilege to be here with all of you tonight, especially to introduce Sadie Barnette, who's an artist whose work we deeply admire collectively and individually. So tonight, on behalf of the Cornell Fine Arts Museum and our co-sponsor, the Lucy Cross Center for Women and their allies at Rollins, it is my privilege to introduce American artist Sadie Barnette. We also want to thank the Thomas P. Johnson Distinguished Visiting Scholar and Artist Fund, which has generously supported the lecture. Sadie Barnette was born in Oakland, California, and she continues to live there and in Compton as well. She earned a BFA from CalArts and an MFA from the University of California, San Diego. Her work has been exhibited throughout the United States in venues including the Studio Museum of Harlem, where she had a residency, and the Oakland Museum of California, and internationally as well. In the forthcoming weeks, she'll be headed to a residency at the Camargo Foundation in Cassis, France. Barnett is the recipient of Art Matters and Artadia Awards and was named one of the Black Artists, 30 Contemporary Art Makers Under 40 You Should Know by the Huffington Post, and has been featured numerous times in publications from the New York Times, the LA Times, to Artforum. Her museum exhibition, Dear 1968, will open for its third and final iteration at the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego this April. Barnett's work is in the permanent collections of museums such as our very own Cornell Fine Arts Museum, as well as the Blanton Museum of Art in Austin, Texas, the Perez Art Museum in Miami, Florida, the California American Art Museum, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. She's represented by Fort Gansevoort in New York City. Adam came today for the talk, and Charlie James in Los Angeles. Whether in significant immersive site-specific installations or individual drawings and photographs, Barnett seeks to merge the quotidian and the transcendent. An ongoing project is centered around her father, Rodney Graham's FBI file. I don't want to steal any of her material from her presentation tonight, so I will limit myself to saying that her re-examination and reclaiming of not only the material, but also the narrative of her family has generated intuitive and magnetic responses for viewers of the work. Her last show at Fort Gansevoort, called Compland, which spanned the entire gallery, demonstrated various intersections of her practice, from bejeweled vernacular family images or crop shots set against crisp fields of glitter paper, alongside precisely drafted text drawings and collage works that evoke the Afro-fantastic. You can look at two examples just to your right there of Sadie's work. Across her varied media, Barnett demonstrates a practice that is diverse, that is immersive, that is research-based, and grounded very much in a personal narrative. We can't wait to learn more from her this evening. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Shrink. And thank you guys so much for having me. It's an honor to be here and to be represented in this collection and to be featured in the gallery alongside two artists whom I admire very much, Kara Walker and Daoud Bey. It's really an honor, so thank you for that. Take a deep breath. I encourage you guys as well to take a deep breath. See, never hurts. So I'm going to chat about a few different projects. I like to start with this image because you can see how one simple strategy moves through a few different mediums. So this is a photograph that I took in my neighborhood in Oakland. It was on Martin Luther King Day, the holiday, and I was walking down Martin Luther King Street and taking photographs and thinking about the dream that MLK speaks of versus the reality of the spaces that the street often occupies now, right? So, we always think of like Martin Luther King Boulevard usually goes through like the hood in any given town or city. And what does that mean, when compared to the activism and effort that went into, organizing to have his name recognized as a national holiday and to have streets and schools named after him. That's one step, but are we really living up to his dream? Not quite. So here is a small collage that I made that ended up working its way into one of my books, which has been an important part of my practice. And so thinking about abstracting this very, urban pedestrian moment into this space, this kind of non-space that we can project onto. And then when I was doing my master's at UC San Diego, I had an opportunity to do a mural at their campus. And the campus there, it feels very institutional, a bit clinical. It was designed after the free speech movement in UC Berkeley, and so it was specifically designed not to be so conducive to community gatherings and rebellious student behavior. So it really feels like a very cold space. And so I wanted to infuse a moment of urban space into this environment. So this is, again, the same photograph, but this time it's printed like 36 feet long on commercial sign vinyl and applied directly to the outside of the building. And so if you look at the left-hand side, it looks like it's the actual building, but if you remember from the photograph, it's the original photograph in Oakland. So you can see if you look here at the very bottom, you can see where the illusion ends. So because the space that they gave me was behind all these trees and bushes, I wanted to work with that instead of against it. So this is what I came up with. It was also for the 40th anniversary of the Thurgood Marshall College, and so the administrators of the college wanted something to, celebrate the history and the founding of the college. I think, they were thinking more like maybe someone from the art department will paint a picture of Thurgood Marshall. But to me, that's not how I work. It's not as, conceptually and rigorously exciting to me as doing something like this where, Martin Luther King, the name, celebrates civil rights, but also allows for some questions about today and, allows the viewer to bring their own experience and make their own decisions. Like, I'm not telling you what to think, I'm just providing, sort of curating this experience of looking at another place. So this is the wall before, so obviously there's a giant tree in front of it, so I figured, using that to help camouflage the image. Okay, then this was when I was doing a residency at the Hermitage, which is also in Florida, like near the Minnesota Key, and just thinking about, sort of traveling in these different spaces, but bringing a part of where you're from with you. And then I was also, I think, reading Octavia Butler and thinking about like global warming and what if like this is what Oakland becomes, is like as the sea rises. This is a book, obviously, the autobiography of Malcolm X, and you can see in the top right corner there's a name, in cursive pen. That's actually my mother's name. So this was my mother's book, and I used this photograph as a way to, again, not just think about Malcolm X, but think about sort of the space he occupies for people, and thinking, what does it mean to this person who has carried this book around? Obviously, it's very, worn and tattered, what's their relationship with this, with this politic, and thinking about it in a more personal way rather than just looking at the icon, but looking at people's relationship to that figure. So that leads us into this main project that I've been working on for the past year, almost 2 years, which engages as source material a 500-page surveillance file kept on my father, Rodney Barnett, during his time with the Black Panthers and with Angela Davis. So we filed a Freedom of Information Act request, and after 4 years of going back and forth and dealing with the bureaucracy of the FBI, we were able to receive the documents. And my father always wanted to request his FBI file just to know what his personal engagement had been with informants and agents during his time organizing in LA. Now his time in the Black Panthers was, he never carried a gun. No one in his chapter ever had a gun. That was sort of what brought the Panthers to public attention, was that, exercising their Second Amendment right to bear arms. But really the day-to-day groundwork was producing a newspaper. It was organizing free breakfast programs, which is still why we have free lunch in schools today in California, is because of the Black Panthers. So these were really, organizing with church members. These were the things that my father was engaged in at the time that he was being surveilled. And I think he thought maybe, we would get like 10 or 30 pages, and that would be very interesting. But we ended up getting back a 500-page dossier. And my father was by no means, one of the most well-known Panthers. He was just one of, thousands of people organizing in his local chapter, which at that time was Compton. He founded the Compton chapter. So I think we were all struck with how intense the surveillance was, for someone who wasn't like, the Huey Newton or the Bobby Seale, and just thinking about what, taxpayer dollars were going to, how much time and attention was being spent investigating American citizens. So I knew that I would want to turn these files into an art project and give them another life as a way to tell my father's story and really reclaim this information. So the first way that I thought to do that would be to splash these documents with pink spray paint to sort of reclaim them using like a material that's usually associated with graffiti, which is like my 80s generation, in contrast with this like 60s teletype typewriter aesthetic. And also, I don't know, how many people know who J. Edgar Hoover is? I mean, you laugh. Older folks are laughing, but younger folks are like, eh. J. Edgar Hoover was the director of the FBI for 38 years, which is really sort of unprecedented in a democracy to have someone in that particular position of power for so long. And he remained really unaccountable and unchecked by any other government agencies for a very, very long time, and engaged in unconstitutional and unconscionable activities that we only learned about later. He was also very homophobic, and so I felt like, splashing his documents with pink spray paint and glitter and rhinestones would probably really anger him. So what you're looking at here is from the exhibition Dear 1968 that was first shown at UC Davis and is going to be shown at the San Diego Contemporary Museum in April. And this is just 28 pages of the file. They're mounted on a pink neon plexiglass, so you kind of get this otherworldly, sort of like dystopian future glow just around the perimeter. And this page in particular had this stamp on it, "Do not destroy National Archives," which was the name of the previous exhibition, Do Not Destroy. And so I've been trying to sort of co-opt some of the language that's found in the file and put it into my own voice. So thinking do not destroy as like, you can't destroy the people, you can't destroy organizing and resistance. You know, the government works for the people, not the other way around. And so just to walk you guys through a couple of the things that were within the file. So this is, you know, a very small amount of text, but it's just a special agent observing my dad and Angela Davis about to board a plane in San Francisco on their way to Chicago. And to me, this page really functioned how a photograph functions. It's just this one moment in time captured in this kind of ghost-like way, and just imagining like the agent, you know, sitting there like behind a newspaper, right? Like, was very chilling. And this was 11 days after Angela Davis was acquitted of all charges. There were no charges brought against my dad ever. So why are they still being followed? This page is recommending my father for the ADEX list, which was also called the Securities Index. And this was a list of American citizens who could be rounded up and detained without due process, which is unconstitutional. And when the Attorney General told J. Edgar Hoover that he couldn't keep such a list, he just changed the name and circulated a memo throughout all the offices saying this is the new name, don't refer to it by the old name, but continued the process. Now this page lists members who my father was organizing with, two of whom, John Huggins and Bunchy Carter, who were assassinated at UCLA. And I think, you know, sometimes when we look back, we forget how young a lot of these folks are. So they're like organizing on a college campus. You know, they're not necessarily older than some of you guys here today. This was one of the pages where I realized, like, wow, I'm actually really lucky that my father is alive. And something that really, you know, brought this close to home. And my father always, you know, when talking about this project or this work, you know, he feels like, yes, it was unjust the way that he was surveilled and, you know, some of the interventions into his private life, but he, you know, by no means thinks that he was the hardest hit by this, since we still have Black Panthers who are in prison. We still have families that have been torn apart, like Erica Huggins, who's an activist and organizer in Oakland, lost her husband at this time. This page details my father's military service. So he was drafted, sent to Vietnam, and I'll show you a piece about that also in a moment, but I decorated this page with Purple Hearts because he received a Purple Heart while wounded in combat, but yet that still, you know, didn't make him American enough to be treated, you know, as such by his own government. So here, this is walking around the museum installation on the back wall. You can see this wallpaper and this diptych. So this is my father on the right or on the left in 1966 and on the right in 1968, and thinking about this transformation from being drafted, going, you know, sent to Vietnam, witnessing horrible atrocities, you know, supposedly in the name of protecting America and American citizens. But he says when he came home, he actually came to Compton to bury his nephew who was killed in the Vietnam War. And he says he felt like he was still at war because of the way the police were engaging in military-style operations and raids in Compton at the time. And you know, here is this whole generation of young Black soldiers coming back and you know, feeling like, why did I just risk my life? Why did my friends die for a country that has no place for me when I come home? And this is something that's happened after every war in our nation's history. So he feels like he has to do something, and what he sees as the most positive thing in the community at the time is the Black Panthers. So he joins, and this is like the very iconic, you know, Panther uniform with the leather jacket and the beret. So to me, I'm thinking of these as like these two American uniforms. And this wallpaper is made up of stamps found within the file, one of which, some of them say like confidential, and one reads racial intel sect. And so, you know, in case there's any mystery or ambiguity about why he's being surveilled, like racial intelligence, that's it. And I was just so struck by the fact that, you know, this was an object, this stamp that our tax dollars went to produce that could be on hundreds of FBI desks, like this stamp, racial interest. I find that to be, I'm not gonna say unbelievable, but very vivid. And then that third photo, he's in another uniform, which we'll get to. This was investigating his job. So he went to one of the Black Panther meetings straight from work, and he worked at the post office. So he had on his post office uniform when he gets to the Panther meeting, and then an informant who's at the meeting, because it's not only, you know, agents observing from afar, it's also people pretending to be Black Panthers, pretending to be, you know, friends, pretending to be in the community that are also reporting back to the federal government, in most cases to probably keep themselves out of jail, which is why so much of the information is unreliable. But in this case, they report that he works for the post office, which is a government job, and they report that he is trying to get his partner on his health insurance because they've just had a baby together, but that they're not married. So he's actually fired from his job at the post office for living with a woman he's not married to. And this is considered behavior unbecoming a government employee, is cohabitating with a woman you're not married to. And the interesting thing about this law, which is not on the books anymore, but was put on the books by Truman to kick gay people out of government jobs, this idea of behavior unbecoming a government employee. But to me, you know, it was used against my father for living with a woman, and it's just one of those examples where, you know, you might think a law doesn't affect you. You know, you might say, well, I'm not an immigrant, so that doesn't affect me, or I'm not Muslim, that has nothing to do with me, but it can be used by whoever, you know, is deemed subversive or, you know, inconvenient or making too much noise at that time. So when people say, you know, if one of us isn't free, none of us are free, I feel like that's very literal. But here, and you know, my father, he applied later for a job at the post office, and they said, have you ever worked at the post office? This was like maybe 10 years later. And he said, yes, I was fired for living with a woman I wasn't married to, and no one believed him, and they looked in the records, and there was no record of him having ever worked there. But when we received the FBI file, there's a statement that my father gives. He's giving it to the post office, not knowing that it's also being sent to the FBI, but it's the second paragraph, and I can read it. He says, "It's true that I'm living with a woman that I'm not married to. I don't think that you're going through a legal ritual of marriage determines the quality of relationship between man and wife. We maintain all the principles of any legal marriage. I think this is a personal thing that should be left up to the judgment of the two parties concerned in accordance with their concept of what morality is." He says, "I believe such relationship has no effect on anyone concerned. In conclusion, in my eyes, we are man and wife as much as anyone else. We have one child born September 1968 at Cleveland, Ohio. He has my first two names and his mother's maiden name." And I was just so struck with like how poised and thoughtful and big picture and patient my dad is at this time. Like, you know, you just had a baby, you're fired from your job. You know, I would have had like 2 words for them and they wouldn't have been this eloquent. But I think it really points to, you know, why he's involved in political organizing, because he's really seeing these bigger picture issues. So this page I highlighted with extra crystals. So this is basically the crime that he committed, is living with this woman, having this child. I mean, you think not being a present father would be the crime, but in this case, the idea that you're living with your family is considered a crime. So moving around the gallery exhibition, you have this other wallpaper, which is created with this image. So, you know, as was said, I work in a lot of different mediums. This is a old Polaroid of one of my little cousins sitting in what I think of as like the iconic Huey Newton chair. And she's got this plastic game piece covering her face so that it's really not about this specific person, but really could be any child at this time, and sort of bringing it to another like dimension or level of consciousness, a little bit of abstraction. So this is like the iconic photo that we think of, but I'm always interested in, you know, the moments that came before and after this. There must be like some little children running around the apartment, and so to me, this idea of like intimacy, the living room, the space beyond, you know, the courtroom and the picket lines where we see all the action, but really what's at stake and why people are fighting and why people are organizing is for their children and for their families. Just as, you know, we're seeing today, it's about like preserving innocence and letting kids be kids and not, you know, gunned down by the police at 12 years old. So it becomes this giant wallpaper to, again, bring in this like domestic space. And there's two drawings that hang on this wall. On the left is the only image in the FBI file, which is this mugshot of my dad. And I was thinking about, you know, photography and the way a mugshot functions, how you can sort of instantly criminalize and dehumanize someone when you take a mugshot. I'm thinking about this, you know, as something that's laying on like hundreds of FBI desks across the country, this man that sort of seems just, you know, disposable and like a threat, even though even at this time he's hauled down to jail, his photograph is taken, but he's never charged with anything. So he believes that he was, you know, arrested just so they could have a picture of him. But, you know, what does it mean for me to draw this in pencil, slowly, you know, laboring over this and trying to turn it into an image of a freedom fighter rather than this like unhuman number of like a suspect. So here's a detail, and this is exactly the way the image appeared in the file. It had been photocopied so many times that it kind of gets this like posterized quality, if you know, are familiar with Photoshop. Which, you know, almost looks like a sort of ready-made political poster. And that hangs alongside this other pencil drawing, which is how J. Edgar Hoover signed these internal documents where he's asking if there's a photograph of my father. And so thinking about Very Truly Yours, it's sort of like, you know, ironic and creepy, but he was also like obsessed in terms of how committed he was to, you know, the destruction of the Black Panther Party and sort of the ruining of lives, you know, often in like very disgusting ways. So this Very Truly Yours kind of calling in this language of family and letter writing, but in this sense of, you know, who is yours and who is American and who's being protected and by whom. So this is also a pencil drawing. So in a way it's, someone pointed out that it was like a forgery in a way of like redrawing his signature. So this is wrapping around the gallery. On the other side of the FBI files, you have this like salon-style hang. And this brings in a lot of the other ways that I work. Again, in the middle is a graphite pencil drawing that reads, "Dear 1968, love 1984." So it's basically this, you know, letter to like my father's generation. 1984 is the year that I was born, but it's also sort of an iconic year in terms of hip hop, and I feel like sort of a turning point in like Reaganomics, and it's also like, you know, the George Orwell book. It's like written about before it even arrives as a sort of like future year. But in this case, in the letter, obviously there's nothing written in the letter except for all this, you know, labored over pencil work. So in a way, it's maybe a thank you note, or it could also be an apology, like, I'm sorry, our generation didn't exactly pick it up, or it could be like a letter asking for answers. What do we do now? Why didn't, your organizing work? Why isn't the world fixed? Why do we still have racism? Why are some people still hungry? So basically it's creating space to hold all of those questions and concerns and that dialogue without really knowing what to say. And then around it, you have some collages, again, with this like glitter paper and kind of creating, okay, here's like a detail of the drawing. This was probably the biggest drawing that I've done. It was about like 50 inches long. So here's one of the collages. It's really hard to photograph this glitter paper, but if you're there in real life, it's like a total hologram experience. And this is a picture of my dad holding me as a little baby. And this is, allowing a space for a celebration, a joy, and maybe like a liberated future that we don't exactly even necessarily have language for, but like this third space, these glitter fields that maybe can act as a placeholder until we figure out how we can make a world that works better for more people. So that element of my work is really important, and it's to sort of celebrate what there is, even amongst all of the problems and questions. So you'll see a bit more of that celebration. This is from my show at Fort Gansevoort in New York in September, and these are graphite wall drawings here. So I've drawn directly on the wall, in this case, this text, from here, and we all we got. And so thinking about we all we got was like something that I used to say with like my friends in LA, and has also appeared in a bunch of songs, and kind of something that people return to, like, all we have is each other, which can both be like positive and lacking in a way, right? Like, all we have is each other, but also like, that's a lot. So I like texts that are specific but also expansive. And this text from here is something that I have come back to a lot. Growing up in Oakland, which is now experiencing a lot of really rapid gentrification, this idea of like actually being from the place became sort of important. So, but also thinking about like, well, we're all sort of from here, or we're all really not from here. So it's sort of, again, a meaning that you have to show up and bring something with you to fully engage with, and also has space for you to project onto. And then there's these photographs above it. So the name of this show was Compland, and it was imagining a blended city between Oakland and Compton, these two like Black California cities that have been very influential both politically and musically, from like, Black Power to hip hop to jazz, just very influential cities considering sort of how small they are. So Compland was like imagining a Black city that maybe could exist outside of police brutality, outside of gentrification, and so like celebrating that space and imagining a new space. This was the floor above the one that you just saw, and if you look really closely on the left, you can see the work that is now here in your museum. So you can see here, it's sort of this larger installation in which many small things become one big thing through like a very simple trope of rainbow order, which is sort of like this thing that like all kids do with markers, is like you got to put it in rainbow order. So using something kind of childlike and innocent to actually like occupy space and be rather bold with. And then you can see there's like the drawing Compland as well. There's a lot of found objects that might just be things I've collected from like 99-cent stores or directly from the street, like this Presto Dinero sign. This like Hello Kitty candy. And a lot of these glitter spaces and scapes, like the one at the very top on the right is like this little children's bike on a kind of gritty, crumbling sidewalk, but surrounding it is this holographic expanse of space, which to me is like, you know, this transcendent, ennobled space beyond like all these earthly problems. This is my little cousin dressed like a cupcake. She's now 13 years old, so I often like, you know, go back and look at family photos that I've, you know, kept over the years and find new purposes for. But again, just like allowing this, you know, tiny little person to occupy all this space and really claim space. And that's my pops. So this piece I created with this technique that I think of as like a in-camera collage. So this black and white like space scene is just printed out on paper and then rolled into a tube. And then there's a neon pink piece of paper at the other end of the tube. And then I put my camera in the paper tube and snap a shot. So you kind of get this constructed environment, and then I collaged the collage element of my dad on there afterward. And I think of it as that he's, you know, pointing towards this like future and pointing the way. Then someone earlier today was telling me that a class, you know, had spent time looking at the work, and they thought of it as like that he's trapped in this space, which I guess, you know, both of our perspectives are exactly what it is. He's still in this space, but looking toward another space. So I was glad to hear that sort of counter reading of it. This is also my dad. I guess this could almost be the opposite, like maybe looking back, which is really, you know, what he's done over the course of this project. But also looking forward. It's been a really amazing opportunity for me. You know, these FBI files has really served as like a container for this family conversation to happen in, and has really sort of formalized all of the questions that I always wanted to ask my dad. And now we like really have a chance to have those family conversations that, you know, sometimes you just put off. And then this is the last thing that I wanted to leave you guys with, which is an art that you can download and make yourself. So this was put on by Open Space, which is a publishing platform out of SF MoMA. And basically they asked me to create something that would be a digital artwork, and they said it can either, you know, remain digital, or it can be something that people can download and put together themselves. So this is like a zine in a series of how-to manuals that I've been making. Most of the how-tos aren't really answered. They're more questions, so don't get your hopes up, but it's fun. But yeah, so I wanted to leave time to make sure to hear from you guys as well. So don't hesitate to ask questions. I'll drink water while you think about it. Yes?
What is your father's reaction to your work then?
Yeah, my father's reaction, I mean, my dad is just a really great guy, so he's been, you know, wonderful to work with and learn from. At one point, someone asked him how he felt at the Oakland Museum, seeing all of, you know, these very personal documents up on the wall, and he said that it made him feel free. And to me, that was, you know, so amazing. Like, if this man who has been through so much, fought in Vietnam War, been beat up by the police, numerous times, was under surveillance. If he could feel free, even just for a moment, that to me was like, okay, the project has done what it was supposed to do. So I think, for him to be able to take something that was meant to suppress him, to dehumanize him, to ruin his life, for him to be able to use that to tell his story and so many other people's story, I think he feels like is a victory. Yeah.
What's the significance of the color fuchsia that you're wearing right now, and then also in your art here?
Right, and the black, I totally look the same. I think, pink has a lot of kind of connotations that it brings with it. I think in terms of the FBI project, I was really thinking about like a little girl and children's toys and like this kind of Hello Kitty manufactured pink, like a plastic pink, like an inorganic pink, like candy that looks like it shouldn't even be eaten. This kind of like neon plastic pink. I'm hesitant when people are doing a feminist art show and then everything's pink, because I don't think that pink should be a stand-in for women. I think that's a little bit ridiculous. But I do think that it can be used to sort of play with this sort of like princess archetype that is sort of like this father-daughter space to occupy. And then again with like the J. Edgar Hoover, thinking about like what would piss him off the most. And I think there's also an element in some of the more abstract works that use pink of just like seduction and appeal, almost like advertising language that to me, I like to sort of make it look really cool and draw you in, and then once you're there, you maybe have to do some thinking and some unpacking and some complicating. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
So following up on the Thank you. Following up with on the relationship with your dad, and you mentioned that this project allowed you to have certain conversations that maybe you hadn't had before, and so I was wondering if those conversations were a result of the project and sort of him looking at what you've done and discussing it together, or were they in the more formative stages for the project where you would talk to him before you actually created the works, or a combination of both?
Yeah, I would say a combination. I mean, I always knew that my dad had been a Black Panther and that he had served in Vietnam, but it wasn't always things that he talked about very readily. I think it was a very difficult time. People died, friendships were, broken apart, especially because of this surveillance and this idea that you couldn't trust anyone. I think it was a really difficult time. I guess now we would say there was like a lot of trauma, right? I don't think he would necessarily explain it in that way. But so, I didn't always want to like poke him for answers. But I think getting this file, it made it feel more like it was his responsibility to share this information with us and a generation. And I think maybe that, made it seem bigger than both of us. And so I always encourage people, to have those conversations with family members and, get out their iPhone and record the conversation and really document that history, because family history is just as important as capital H history that's in the books. And I think it's also been, great that with it being the 50th anniversary of the Black Panthers, I think, there's been a lot of intergenerational conversation, and he's really gotten a sense of how much young people today admire that work and that moment and the language that they created, and are still trying to learn from it.
I have a question that is just about your process, and insofar as so much of your work is really based in a kind of research methodology. How much, I'm thinking specifically of the FBI work, I guess, but how much like heft or weight, this is kind of a question of like in a process-based practice, like where are your kind of like emphases as an artist? Like, so I'm just curious about the act, like the actual act of like making the information request. And like you say, it's being this 4-year process, and I imagine a ton of bureaucracy and a ton of back and forth, and that kind of like laboring to like exercise your right to like have this information about like yourself and your family. Is that, how much do you, when you're putting these projects together that like formally are about a kind of reclaiming, like how much do you sort of think about that whole end of the project being sort of like a part of the total work? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, really the process of requesting was really a family effort. Of course, my dad was the one who first, wanted this information. My mother was really instrumental in like following through all the bureaucratic loops when I feel me and my father probably would have given up a couple times. And the process of all reading through the information, at separate locations, but talking about it together. I think, the process of turning it into objects was really me thinking about, like, how can I not get in the way of this information? It's so powerful and sort of potent and scary and political and personal that I really wanted to think about my job as more of, curating an experience, making like visual moments for like cognitive experiences to happen, but without me like editorializing it too much, because I feel like it was already there. And in general, I really think of my work more of a way of seeing rather than a way of making. Like some artists, I think they have a very ritualistic relationship with their materials. Like they show up, they stretch canvas, they mix paint. There are certain times of day they like to work. They paint for a certain number of hours. But to me, it's more about seeing things, and the way that they are executed could be different every time. So sometimes, I might go a month without drawing, and I'm just like shooting photographs and not even knowing what's gonna happen with it. Or, putting objects together that doesn't really involve making, but really is like about seeing and an edit. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Tour is finished. What do you think was the most difficult, like emotionally wise, and also like throughout everything that you've done? Because it took you sometimes, obviously, and it's a long process, and I'm sure there are struggles and like difficulties, but what would you say is the hardest for you, like throughout the whole project?
I think, one thing that I was concerned about in the beginning was just, the Black Panthers are so iconic and sort of known for like this image of the, leather jackets and the guns and the sunglasses, but not necessarily really that much time spent thinking about like their 10-point platform, or their like very international and intersectional analysis, or their systemic analysis. And I was just, didn't want people to kind of enter at the surface level and just stay there. So I think, I wasn't really sure how to introduce the work to the world until the first time it was shown was at the Oakland Museum for the All Power to the People, Black Panthers at 50 exhibition. And I knew that it would really be contextualized there because the whole point of the exhibition was to talk about the community service programs, the free ambulance program that the Black Panthers ran in Oakland, and really, talking about women in leadership in the Panthers and just really complicating our view. And so I think that was the first time that I felt comfortable sharing this work. And then from then, it's, sort of lived a life of its own.
I have another quick question. So, it's still people are still very close-minded even today, and they will have different opinion and concept when it comes to like issues like this. And obviously, before you finished the project and ready to show to the public, obviously, like you would go through this mindset where like how people's gonna react, and obviously there are different people who's gonna think differently about the issue because, like I said, people are still quite close-minded. How did you deal with that like struggle, like specifically?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think the way I deal with it is just to, tell my own story and my own truth, and that way it's not really something you can argue with. It's just what happened in my family, and everybody is going to bring their own histories or bias to the table, but I'm not really trying to like win a campaign. I'm just trying to honor something that I believe in, and to see a people that I believe in, and to see my family, and to honor my family, and to love my family, and to create space for other people to think about loving each other more. And if that's your goal, then like you can't really go wrong.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, but that said, you must be thinking about the intersection of current events while you're, especially when you talk. So talk about that intersection.
Yeah, I mean, we're both like, yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of the perfect time to show this work. I mean, I already thought it was, sort of eerily relevant in thinking about like, police brutality and Black Lives Matter over the past couple years. But then, everything that's going on with the FBI right now, I mean, I didn't want this to be more relevant, but it just, history has a way of repeating itself and announcing itself. And so I think, we're at another one of those moments where, it becomes possible that government agencies are, acting politically, and that they're not, over the failings of individual people. And we're having one of those moments where, hopefully individual people and societies realize that we have to pay attention and know what's going on and hold these agencies accountable. So, I mean, it's just, I feel like while it's, troubling, everything that we're going through politically, it's also impossible to ignore. And so the idea that, maybe the government isn't working for all of its citizens is like not foreign now, as maybe, 10 years ago, a lot of people might not have identified with that statement. So, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I don't even know where to begin, but that's the beginning. Anything else? Thank you guys so much for having me.